Hey, it's Jonathan here from Mindful Communication, and in this video, I'm going to be doing a book summary of Michael Bungay Stanier's book, The Advice Trap. Be humble, stay curious, and change the way you lead forever. And specifically, I'm going to give you my 5 biggest takeaways from the book so that you can take a bunch of these learnings and actually apply them into your life. All right, let's get into MBS's The Advice Trap book. The first point that I want to share with you is that advice isn't bad, it just doesn't always work that well. Now, one thing Michael talks about at the beginning of the book and kind of peppers through the book is that advice isn't necessarily bad. He's not saying that it's wrong, and he's not saying that we should stop giving advice. Advice, in fact, is really important. In fact, if you even think about it, this video is going to be laden with advice. That said, what he's trying to point out is that we often jump to advice giving as our default. And he's encouraging us to just be a little bit more patient, a little bit more curious, to delay in terms of that default reaction. And by doing that, we become more coach-like, which is one of the major themes of this book. So once again, advice isn't bad, it's just our default reaction into advice giving that doesn't always serve us. Now, the second point I want to talk about is that giving advice doesn't work well. And this is important for us to keep in mind because when it comes to advice giving, we often jump to it and we think it's really great when we can give some really solid advice. Recognizing that our advice usually isn't as great as we think, we'll actually be more inclined to actually bite our tongues, to withhold on giving our advice right away as an instant reaction, and instead be more measured and calm when it comes to jumping into the conversation like that. Michael outlines 2 major reasons why giving advice doesn't work as well as we think. The first is that we're solving the wrong problem. He really talks about this idea that the problem that people are initially bringing up is rarely the actual challenge that they're facing. There's a great quote from the book. It reads, "The problem we're trying to solve rarely is. But because we're all twitchy keen to help and primed to get into action, we love to jump in and solve the first thing that shows up, even when it's not the actual thing that needs to be figured out." Maybe this has happened to you in a situation before. Someone says they need help with this thing, and although you give some really solid advice, it turns out that as the conversation continues and morphs, it's not actually about that thing, it's about something completely different. And Michael says that this actually happens way more often than you think. So before you jump into advice giving, hold out. You may not actually be dealing with the correct challenge. And the second reason why advice giving doesn't work as well as we think is because we're often actually giving very mediocre solutions. Now you might be thinking, no way, that's not me. I give great advice. I am one of the best advice givers on the planet. Listen, I don't blame you for thinking like that. I feel the same way. Generally, we think that our ideas are pretty excellent. That's why we're happy to give our advice, to jump in with our ideas. But the reason that our advice and our ideas often fall short is because we don't usually have the full picture. Because we're not there asking the questions, staying curious, and instead just jumping into this advice giving mode, we're not actually getting all the details that we need in order to make a really solid recommendation. And this is a natural phenomenon. We have this thing called the self-serving bias. And so what we naturally think of is solution based on biases that are serving ourselves. And naturally, if our solutions are serving ourselves, they're not necessarily serving the other person. So when it comes to advice giving, remember that it doesn't always work as well as you think. 1, because we're often solving the wrong problems, and 2, because as amazing as you think your ideas are, they're probably not that amazing. My third major takeaway is that you can't be more coach-like if you're not being curious. Michael really hits this point home throughout the entire book. He really talks about engaging in this element of curiosity. And I think that the reason that's important to touch on is because when we're trying to change our behaviors, we often don't want to say what it is that we should stop doing. We also want to make sure to replace that behavior with what it is that we should do instead. And in this case, Michael is talking about jumping into this advice-giving behavior. And he wants us to replace it with this curiosity kind of behavior. He wants us to stay curious a bit longer. And his books are all around bringing this coach-like behavior to our lives and our work environments. And what he's saying here is that you simply can't be more coach-like if you're not being curious. So that's the key to really bringing more coachness to your life, is be curious. Don't jump into advice giving right away. Hold off. Ask a few more questions before you give advice, then jump in with some ideas that you might have. My fourth biggest takeaway from his book is coaching is no longer an event, it's a way of being with each other. And what I love about this idea is that Michael is moving away from coaching being some sort of nebulous thing that we don't understand, and he's trying to bring coaching to be more into this realm of a way of being. What we want to do is we want to go through life being more like a coach. And when we walk around being more like a coach, we're being more curious, we're being more open-minded, we're being less judgmental. I love this distinction because we want to make sure to recognize that coaching is not asking the right questions, it's not saying the right things. It really is this way of being that you're bringing into your life. And what that means is that you don't need to take any special courses to be more coach-like. And at the same time, it's not like if you take a course, then all of a sudden you are being more coach-like. It really is just a way of being. It's a way you show up in the world, and it's a practice. The fifth biggest takeaway I have from Michael's book is the idea to be generous. I absolutely love this. This is one of his values for his companies, and it just is such an awesome value to bring into our lives. Being generous can apply to so many different aspects, and he really brings it into this communication realm of being generous with people. And the way that manifests is three different ways. The first is to be generous with silence. He wants us to bring more silence into our conversations. Don't feel as inclined to rush and jump to giving advice, to even saying anything, to asking questions. Really be okay with the silence. Make sure that you're starting to feel more comfortable with those nice long pauses. Be generous with those, and you're going to see the fruits of your labor very quickly. The other way that he wants us to be generous is with us being transparent, with transparency. He wants us to be more vulnerable, more open. That is a direct access to us being more coach-like, because when we can step out of our protective shells, when we can be more vulnerable and open with others, we actually create the space for others to be more vulnerable and open with us. By being transparent, you really foster this sense of trust. And when you have trust, you can do better work together, not necessarily just in a work context, but even in any kind of relationship. And the last way that he talks about being generous is to be generous with appreciation. Now, I couldn't agree more with this one. I think acknowledgments and appreciation is something that we all crave in our lives. And as much as we crave it, we're often not that good at giving it. And it could be because we don't know how to give it, but most likely it's just because we don't think of doing it. And yet it's something that we want so badly. And so Michael is inviting us to be more generous with that appreciation. Go ahead and appreciate others more in your life. Tell them what it is that you like about them. What qualities of theirs really brighten your day? What actions have they taken that have made your life easier? Whatever way that you want to appreciate them, make sure it's coming from your heart and it's genuine, and it's not in order to get something from them. And as a side note, you're probably gonna start noticing that as you give more appreciation, you're gonna start getting it back. So those were my 5 biggest takeaways from The Advice Trap. There were lots more nuggets, and if you wanna read those nuggets, make sure to get his book. I also had the great opportunity to interview Michael on my podcast, the Mindful Communication Podcast, and you can check that out at the link in the description. That's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, give it a big thumbs up, a like for the video. You can also find me on Instagram, and you can find me on Facebook. You'll find lots of amazing communication tips and tricks and much more than that on those channels. And of course, like I mentioned before, you can check out the Mindful Communication Podcast, where I interview thinkers, experts, and influencers from all over the world around the art and science of connection, how we relate to each other. It's really great. Make sure to check it out. And finally, what I do is I help established entrepreneurs live a life that's as successful as their business. If that's something that you're interested in learning more about, make sure to go to my website and get in touch with me. You'll find the link to that in the description. That's all for today's video. We'll see you next time.